lowered his head slightly, his hands hanging by his side like a marionette, waiting for his puppet master to guide him. His face was bluish-white, delicate, and pretty to the point where he could almost be said to have a melancholy beauty. But since his eyes were a plain of deathly white, bare of pupils, and black cracks crept from his neck to his cheeks, his beautiful melancholy was transformed into a dreadful gloom. The hem and sleeves of his robe were shredded and ragged, revealing wrists as terribly pale as his face, shackled inside pitch-black iron rings and wrapped in iron links along with his ankles. The dragging chains had produced the clinks and clangs that they had heard earlier. Once he stilled, all returned to deathly silence. It wasn't hard to figure out why all the cultivators present were scared out of their wits. Wei Wuxian was not a bit calmer than the rest. Waves of fear crashed over his head, and his heart convulsed with dread. The problem wasn't that Wen Ning was there, but that he was anywhere in the world of the living. Long before the siege of the burial mounds, his bones were supposed to have been crushed into dust and his ashes scattered to the four winds. When Jin Ling heard the others shout the name Wen Ning, the tip of his sword, which had been pointed at the soul-eating maiden, seemed to turn in a different direction of its own accord. The maiden, taking advantage of his slip of attention, gleefully extended her arm, grabbed him, and dangled him from her fingers. She opened her mouth and brought Jin Ling close to her face. Seeing this, Wei Wuxian raised the flute again, but didn't have time to calm the shudders which suddenly ran through his heart. His hands trembled, and the note he blew trembled with it. As the flute was crude, the noise was both raspy and painful to hear. The sad instrument emitted 2 wails, and Wen Ning, following the sound, began moving. In a single motion, he transported himself in front of the soul-eating maiden. His palm collided with her neck, which cracked beneath his assault. Her body remained stationary, but the force of the blow twisted her head until it stood in the opposite direction from the rest of her body. Yet, she still continued to smile. Wen Ning hacked at her again, cleaving her right hand, which held Jin Ling, clean from her arm. She lowered her head and looked at her severed wrist. Rather than wrenching her head back in the proper direction, she turned until both her head and back were facing Wen Ning. Afraid to relax for a single second, Wei Wuxian bowed his head for a breath and then commanded Wen Ning to face her head-on. However, his bewilderment quickly grew. Low-level walking corpses had no ability to think for themselves and thus required instruction and ongoing guidance. Even the more dangerous, fierce corpses also frequently had adult minds and lacked true consciousness. But Wen Ning's situation was different. He was forged by Wei Wuxian. Back in the day, even the fiercest corpses were no match for him. He could think and learn, and other than his lack of fear of injury, fire, cold, poison, anything that caused the hearts of the living to shiver with dread, he was no different from any other human. But it was obvious that the Wen Ning in front of him had no mind of his own. As Wei Wuxian muddled through his startled confusion, surprised shouts sounded from the gathered crowd. Wen Ning had battered and kicked the soul-eating maiden into submission and was now holding her fast to the ground. Beside him, a boulder taller than a human stood, which he lifted and smashed directly onto the stone maiden's body, pounding her into dust. From the center of the pale ring of rocky debris, a pearl haloed by snow-white light rolled out. The core that had condensed from the 10 or so living souls that she had swallowed. If it was taken back and carefully dealt with, the souls that she had recently eaten could still be returned to their bodies. However, everyone was too busy to care about the pearl. All of the swords, which had originally been pointed at the soul-eating maiden, now turned to another target. One cultivator hissed forcefully, "Surround him." Some hesitated but answered the cry, but even more wavered and slowly retreated. The same cultivator again shouted, "My fellow cultivators, we must stop him and prevent him from escaping. This is winning." These remarks woke up the crowd a little. How could a mere soul-eating creature compare to the ghost general? Though they had no idea why he had appeared, killing even 1,000 soul-eating spirits was no match for capturing a single winning. After all, this was the Yiling Patriarch's most obedient servant, a rabid dog which snapped without warning. Accomplishing such a thing would bring them great fame in the world of cultivation, and the value of their names would soar skyward. After all, they had rushed to Dafan Mountain to fight over some ghastly beast or fiend for the sake of increasing their accomplishments. Rallied by this sort of cry, some were inevitably roused to fight, but the senior cultivators who had witnessed Wen Ning's madness with their own eyes still dared not rush into action. The cultivator yelled one more time, "Why are you afraid? It's not like the Yiling Patriarch is here." The seniors considered the situation a bit more. Right, why be afraid? His master's corpse had already been torn into thousands of little pieces. With these words, the ring of swords which surrounded Wen Ning abruptly shrunk. The fierce corpse swung his arms, and the heavy black iron chains whipped around him, knocking away all of the blades. He promptly stepped out of the circle and seized the nearest person's neck, slowly lifting him until his feet left the earth. Wei Wuxian could feel that he had played his flute with too much urgency, too much ferocity, and allowed Wen Ning to grow too vicious. He had to be suppressed. Steadying his emotions, Wei Wuxian confidently played a different tune. This melody flowed naturally from his heart. It was gentle and tranquil, worlds away from the bizarre, ear-piercing notes that he had played earlier. Upon hearing it, Wen Ning stiffened, then slowly turned toward the origin of the sound. Wei Wuxian stood in the same place that he had in the beginning and met his pupil-less gaze. A moment later, Wen Ning released the man that he was choking, who tumbled to the ground. He lumbered step by step in Wei Wuxian's direction, his two arms hanging limply by his sides. His head drooped and he dragged his chains, appearing disheartened. Wei Wuxian stepped backwards as he played, luring him over. This proceeded for a period, but as the Yiling Patriarch withdrew into the mountain forest, a pure, chilly sandalwood scent invaded his nose. Shortly, his back collided with someone, and pain wrung around his wrist. The sound of the flute abruptly ceased. An ominous feeling crept into his heart. He turned, and his gaze met Lan Wangji's pale, icy eyes. This wasn't good. Lan Wangji had personally seen him conduct corpses by flute in his previous lifetime. With one hand, Wei Wuxian's old acquaintance clenched him tightly, while Wen Ning stood dazed about 5 meters away. The fierce corpse looked around slowly, as though searching for the flute melody that had suddenly vanished. Somewhere far away, across the forest, firelight shone, and the sounds of humans crept closer. Wei Wuxian considered turning around and making an escape, but promptly decided against it. So what if someone saw him? Millions of people could play the flute, and the Yiling patriarch had enough flute-playing imitators to start a whole sect of corpse puppeteers. Even if they beat him to death, he would never admit his true identity. Firmly deciding to ignore the hand clamped around him, he lifted his arms and continued blowing. This time, his playing was more nervous, more urgent. His breath was unsteady, the ends of his notes cracked, and the tune was both mournful and agonizing to hear. Suddenly, Lan Wangji's hands tightened, crushing Wei Wuxian's wrists to the point that they felt in danger of snapping. Unable to withstand the pain, he loosened his fingers, and his bamboo flute clattered to the ground. By now, his instructions were clear enough. Thus Wen Ning quickly retreated and vanished without a trace into the shadowy forest. Wei Wuxian feared that Lan Wangji would follow, intercept, and kill the fierce corpse. So he grabbed his old acquaintance in return. But who knew that throughout the whole exchange, Lan Wangji would not spare a single glance for Wen Ning, and instead pin his sharp, unbreakable stare solely on Wei Wuxian. Thus, the two continued clutching each other, eyes fixed on each other's faces. Then Jiang Cheng rushed onto the scene. He had been sitting at Forjiao village, waiting for the outcome of the night hunt with forced patience. However, before he had finished a single cup of tea, a disciple who had anxiously fled the mountain ran up to him and began yammering on about how the thing on Dafan Mountain did such and such, how it was this, how it was that, how it was vicious and terrifying. Jiang Cheng's heart began fluttering and quaking upon hearing this, so he bolted back up the mountain, shouting, "Ah Ling!" Although Jin Ling had nearly lost his soul, he had now recovered from the experience. Standing solidly on the ground, he replied, "Uncle." Upon seeing that Jin Ling was fine, Jiang Cheng's heart crashed back to earth like a boulder. Immediately furious, he said, "Didn't you bring a signal? Don't you know to fire it if you encounter something like this? Don't try to show off. Come here." Since Jin Ling hadn't caught the soul-eating maiden, he was also angry. "Wasn't it you who told me that I had to take the thing down no matter what?" he said. "You told me that if I didn't get it, I should never come see you again." Jiang Cheng wanted to slap the stinking brat so hard he'd fly back up his mother's birth canal, but he did actually say those words. Since he couldn't very well embarrass himself, the clan chief could only turn to sarcastically mocking the cultivators scattered randomly all over the ground. "So what exactly thrashed all of you into looking so dignified?" he said. Among the rainbow colors of robes, there were many disciples of the Yunmeng Zheng clan, ordered by Jiang Cheng to disguise themselves and secretly assist Jin Ling, for fear that his nephew would be unable to take down his prey. The efforts of these senior disciples were wasted as well. One of the cultivators, whose eyes were still glued blankly to the ground, said, Chief Jiang, it's Wen Ning." Suspecting that he had misheard, Jiang Cheng said, "What did you say?" "Wen Ning's back," the cultivator stuttered. In the blink of an eye, shock, hatred, wrath, and disbelief assailed him all at once, crossing and commingling in his expression. A long time passed before he spoke again, his voice cold. "That thing was burned to ashes and scattered to the winds long ago. How could it be back?" The cultivator said, "It was Wen Ning, undoubtedly. I couldn't have seen it incorrectly." Suddenly, he pointed toward Wei Wuxian. He was the one who summoned him here, he said. Wei Wuxian and Lan Wangji, still deadlocked, instantly became the center of the crowd's attention. Jiang Cheng's electric, cold gaze slowly turned in Wei Wuxian's direction. Moments later, the corner of Jiang Cheng's mouth pulled upward into a twisted smile. His left hand began unconsciously caressing his ring again. Good, good, he said. You've returned. He released the ring. A long whip hung down from his hand. The whip was extremely thin, and true to its name, consisted of a bright, crackling violet current, which looked as though it had been stolen from some thundercloud-covered horizon. He gripped one end firmly in his hand. When he brandished it, lightning struck, fast, nimble, and chaotic. Before Wei Wuxian could even move, Lan Wangji's Guqin was already in its owner's steady and sure hand. He plucked a single string, and like a stone dropped in water stirs 1,000 ripples, the sound of the Guqin reverberated through the air in countless waves. The note and Zidian struck each other. The former waxed, and the latter waned. Jiang Cheng's earlier intention to categorically avoid rash confrontation and crossing the Lan clan seemed to have been devoured by wild dogs. The midnight sky above the mountain forest flashed with violet light, then lit up like the morning sky, then shook with a boom of thunder, then rung with the Guqin's rich tones. The other cultivators hastily retreated to a safe distance and watched from the sidelines, trembling in fear, yet unable to tear their eyes away. When all was said and done, the opportunity to observe such famous cultivators from such distinguished sects cross swords was rare, and the fiercer and more vicious it was, the better. Moreover, certain unspoken wishes circulated amongst the spectators. If the Lan clans and the Jiang clan's relationship was truly ruptured, now that would be interesting. On the other hand, Wei Wuxian seized the opportunity and ran. Everyone looked on, shocked. Hadn't he only avoided the whip because Lan Wangji had stepped in front of him and blocked it? By fleeing, wasn't he signing his own death warrant? Indeed, Jiang Cheng seemed to have grown eyes on the back of his head, and seeing that Wei Wuxian had left Lan Wangji's protection, how could he give up the opportunity to strike? He raised his whip and cracked it as long. Zidian lashed out at Wei Wuxian like a venomous dragon, landing right in the middle of his back. The blow would have sent him flying directly into a tree had the donkey not been standing in the way. But after the strike, Lan Wangji and Jiang Cheng stopped fighting, both stunned. Wei Wuxian rubbed his lower back and crawled back up, holding the donkey for support. He hid behind it and cried, "Amazing! So amazing! As long as you and your family are powerful, you can do whatever you want. You can attack people whenever you want." Humph. Startled and angry, Wei Wuxian continued, "What's going on?" Zidian had a special ability. If it struck a body snatcher, the body snatcher's soul would immediately be peeled away from the body that they had stolen. Zidian expelled the invader without exception. But this person had been whipped, yet behaved just as he did before, bouncing around as usual. Unless he really hadn't seized the body, there was no other explanation. Wei Wuxian thought, how useless. Obviously, Zidian can't whip my soul out. I didn't steal this body. Someone offered it to me. Actually, he practically forced it on me. Jiang Cheng's expression was surprised but suspicious, and the intention to whip Wei Wuxian again crossed his eyes. But Lan Jingyi shouted, "Chief Jiang, isn't once enough? This is Zidian. A cultivation tool the level of Zidian wouldn't fail on the first try, only to succeed on the second. If no soul was expelled, then no soul was expelled. If someone hadn't snatched the body, they hadn't snatched the body, or else the weapon was undeserving of its reputation. After Lan Wangji's shot, Jiang Cheng, a man who cherished reputation and prestige as much as life, was able to act no longer. But if this man wasn't Wei Wuxian, who could he be? Who else had the ability to summon Wei Ning? However Jiang Cheng thought about the matter, it was unacceptable. He jabbed his finger at Wei Wuxian. Stony-faced, he shouted, "Who the hell are you?" One of the bystanders thought that he finally had a contribution to make. Coughing hoarsely, he interjected, "Chief Jiang, you probably don't pay much attention to these things, so there are a few things you might not know. This here is Mo Shanyu, one of the Lan Ling Jin clans. Ahem. He was once one of the Jin clan's outer disciples. But since his spiritual power was very low and he was lazy, and moreover, there was the matter of, he harassed a fellow cultivator, so he was kicked out of the clan. I also heard that he went insane. In my opinion, he probably chose to take the corrupt path because he was furious that he had failed on the righteous one. He may not actually be that healing patriarch in a stolen body." Jiang Cheng replied, Matter of what?" "The matter of, that matter," the cultivator said. Unable to stand it any longer, someone else shouted, "His love of men." Jiang Cheng's brows wrinkled, then unwrinkled, and the hatred in his eyes toward Wei Wuxian grew. There were a few more things that the others did not dare say in front of Jiang Cheng. Even if the healing patriarch's reputation was bad, people had to admit that prior to Wei Wuxian's defection from the Yunmeng Zheng clan, he had been famous far and wide for being a gorgeous man, cultured, sophisticated, and proficient in all the arts of a gentleman. Among the young masters of all the clans of cultivation, his appearance and personality were considered the fourth best, and he was described as bright, clever, and full of life. The irascible Jiang Cheng was fifth, and had to endure being beaten by him, a fact that no one dared mention. But Wei Ying conducted himself in a reckless, libertine fashion, and loved to have secret entanglements with beautiful women. No one knew how many female cultivators had suffered disaster because of his shameful love affairs, but no one had ever heard of him liking men. Even if he wanted to snatch someone's body to come back and avenge his own death, someone as cultured as Wei Ying couldn't have chosen this gay lunatic who ate fruit while riding a donkey and painted his face to make himself look like a hanged ghost. Yet another person muttered, "No matter how you look at it, it isn't him, right? Plus, his flute playing is awful. He hasn't really learned to play, only to make ridiculous, shoddy imitations." During the Sunshot campaign, when the Yiling Patriarch took to the battlefield, he blew his flute the entire long night, directing the 1,000-strong battle lines of his ghost army. He swept away all opposition, annihilating anyone, man or god, who stood in his way. The sound of his flute was like music from the heavens. How could anyone ever mention it in the same sentence as the hoots and wails of the discarded son of the Jin clan? No matter how terrible Wei Wuxian was as a person, they couldn't be compared. It was too insulting. Wei Wuxian felt a bit depressed. You try being out of practice for 10 to 20 odd years than playing a crappy flute you hastily carved in 4 or 5 slices. If you sound good, I'll bow down before you, he thought. Only moments before, Jiang Cheng had been so certain that this person was Wei Wuxian that all the blood in his body had gone cold and then boiled over in rage. But now, his Zidian told him loudly and clearly that he wasn't. Zidian couldn't possibly lie to him, and even less could it make an error. The clan chief rapidly calmed himself and silently thought, "It isn't as though I can't deal with this. Worst comes to worst, I'll find some excuse to bring him back to Yunmeng and then use every method I can to beat the truth out. There's no need to worry about failing to get anything from him. He can hardly keep everything hidden. It's not as though I haven't done this type of thing before." Once he had made up his mind, he made a hand signal. His disciples understood and started to surround Wei Wuxian. Holding onto the donkey's reins, the Yiling patriarch hopped behind Lan Wangji. His hands clasped over his heart, he exclaimed with surprise, "Hey, what are you trying to do to me?" Lan Wangji glanced at him and endured his loud, overdramatic, and extremely rude behavior. Upon seeing that Lan Wangji had no intention of making way for him, Jiang Cheng said, "Second, Master Lan, are you deliberately making life difficult for the humble man in front of you?" No cultivator was unaware of how the Zheng clan's young chief guarded against Wei Wuxian's return with an insane zeal bordering on demonic. He would rather seize the wrong person and never let them go than to pass up anyone who had the slightest chance of being the Yiling patriarch. As soon as he saw anyone that he suspected of being Wei Wuxian, he would haul him back to Yunmeng and try to torture a confession out. If they allowed Jiang Cheng to tie this person up and take him away, it would undoubtedly be the same as letting the clan chief beat the poor man half to death. Thus, Lan Wangji said, "Chief Jiang, the facts are laid out in front of you. Young Master Mo's body hasn't been snatched. Is it really necessary to make things so difficult for a nameless disciple?" Jiang Cheng replied coldly, "Then why is it necessary for second Master Lan to protect a nameless disciple so fastidiously?" Suddenly, Wei Wuxian let out a couple of puffs of barely suppressed laughter. He said, "Chief Jiang, involving yourself with me like this, I feel very awkward." A muscle twitched in Jiang Cheng's temple. He had a suspicion that the next thing this person was going to say would not make him look good. "You're too kind, thank you," Wei Wuxian said. "But you've overthought this. Just because I like men doesn't mean I like any and all men. And it definitely doesn't mean I'll go with any man who waves at me. You're really not my type." Wei Wuxian was deliberately trying to embarrass him. The thing that Jiang Cheng hated the most was being compared unfavorably with someone else, no matter how dumb the comparison. As long as someone said he wasn't as good as some other person, his temper would rise and he would forget everything except winning. Indeed, Jiang Cheng's face had turned green. "Oh," he said, "then please tell me, what type do you like?" "What type?" Wei Wuxian replied. I really like Han Guangjun, his type." Lan Wangji was unable to put up with this kind of frivolous, silly joke. Once he was sufficiently embarrassed, he would definitely take the initiative, draw a clear line between them, and keep his distance. Embarrassing both people at once, it was like killing 2 birds with 1 stone. But who knew that when Lan Wangji heard Wei Wuxian's words, he'd turn around. Expressionless, he said, You are the one saying this. Wei Wuxian said. Lan Wangji turned back and without breaking etiquette, spoke in a tone that brooked no argument. I am taking this person back to Lan Clan. Huh? Wei Wuxian asked.